relatively new model. Does that show up?
Yep.
We are picking these nice,
see it, yeah.
attractive colours. It does?
Yes.
All right. It's nice, attractive colours, and then they don't show up. We look at a relatively new model. The first publication was late 2007. Doors will be shut, please. Going to have a read notice on this door. That's good. So that we have to have the door shut, and any minute now that alarm will go off, and then we'll get into trouble because the door doesn't shut. Guys, hurry in. Door has to be shut. Hey, all right. So this article is up on Blackboard, I believe. Please check. If it's not there, give me a yell. But I'm pretty sure I put it up there. And we're looking at this model is trying to give us an idea of some of the factors that play a role in the health issues and overweight, obesity issues that we're seeing with individuals now. So the initial authors, Dave Stodden and Jackie Goodway, were looking at the fact that we have lots of information about people not doing physical activity and the link between physical activity and overweight and obese issues, but no one had really taken a developmental perspective of that. Right? So they wanted to look at how this changes across time and what factors are playing a role in here. Okay?
Dr. Moore, is this still part of chapter 18?
No.
Okay.
So the idea that they were thinking about when they started this was that there's some link between getting these children competent in their fundamental motor skills when they're young and what we see happen across middle childhood and into adolescence. So they've also looked at youth. So what they believe is that developing motor competence, and by motor competence they're specifically looking at fundamental motor skills, so jumping, catching, throwing, striking, kicking, all right, particularly object control skills, because those take even more teaching than locomotor skills do, and locomotor skills take quite a bit of teaching, all right, as we're starting to see out on the playground. So what do we see the link as we get older? Okay. So what the model that they came up with, I think it's a little convoluted. I tell Jackie she should simplify this a little bit, but she doesn't take that on board. What they were looking at is that when you look at the literature on physical activity and motor competence in preschool children, that there is a weak link there where we see that physical activity, the children who are most physically active start to develop the best movement skills. Right? So in early childhood, levels of physical activity seem to drive motor competence. So those levels of physical activity are linked to all kinds of different events. It can be your whether or not you've got siblings. It can be your socioeconomic status. It can be the opportunity, the environment, what's on the playground, right? What are the opportunities you have to be physically active? So the more physically active they are, the better their motor skills, their fundamental motor skills tend to be. So can we provide more opportunity for young children to be physically active and choose to be physically active? Right? So the more active I am, the better my motor skills are. Now, preschoolers, their cognitive awareness of their motor competence is a little tenuous, to say the least, right? So perceived motor competence in very young children is a little bit tricky because they're not very accurate when they're giving their perception of their motor competence. They say, oh yeah, I'm really good at skipping, when clearly they can't skip for toffee, right? So they're not very accurate when we look at perceived competence. So perceived motor competence really doesn't play as much of a role with the preschoolers as it does as we get older, right? So my physical activity is driving my motor competence, and we see some health-related fitness benefits from increased levels of both of those, even with young children. So their BMI, for what it's worth, is in a healthy range rather than in an overweight range, for example. Or an underweight range. We've got several children whose BMIs are underweight this year on the playground. Right? And so we have this kind of driving force for motor competence. Now, as we transition into middle childhood, then the picture changes a little bit, because in middle childhood, around 7, 8, right, children start to cognitively become very aware of their performance in relation to their peer group. So now we've got a change in the picture, because now their motor competence starts to impact their perceived motor competence. And what we find is that people who perceive they're not very good at something opt out, given the choice, right? So if we've got low motor competence coming out of kindergarten and first grade, then that low motor competence starts to impact the child's perceived motor competence. And if I'm not very good at something, it's also going to start impacting how physically active I can be. Right? If I don't have the skill set to be physically active, then it becomes more and more difficult to be physically active. And I'm starting to think I'm not very good at this anyway, so I don't choose to be physically active. Right? So we get like a double whammy on our physical activity levels for children with low motor competence. And we start to see an impact on their health-related fitness. Okay. So once my physical activity levels drop down, now I'm at an increased risk of developing obesity. So physical activity levels that are low, and low motor competence and low perceived motor competence feed into the possibility of developing an unhealthy weight. Right? Whereas high levels of physical activity, high levels of motor competence, and high levels of perceived motor competence drive a more positive picture, and we're more likely to achieve a healthy weight. And then that healthy weight or that unhealthy weight feed back in, because if I'm an unhealthy weight, my motor competence is going to decrease. And if my motor competence gets worse, then my physical activity choices get worse. Right? So if you think about the kinds of physical activity choices we offer to 10-year-olds, and then look at what we're doing as they hit adolescence and puberty, right, and become teenagers, what movement choices do we offer them and what are they picking? Right? A lot of the movement choices that we offer are skill-based. Right? We play dodgeball. We play soccer, we play rounders, you guys don't play netball, we play basketball, right? So the things that we offer them to do to be physically active, because we know we've got to get them physically active, so we try to offer them events and things to do that would get them highly active, right? We run around the track. Well, that's great if I'm at a healthy weight, but if I'm an unhealthy weight, running around the track is not very much fun. Okay. So I would opt out of it if I can, or I'm not going to put forth a lot of effort. I'm going to go as slow as I can get away with. Does that make sense? So what we see as we transition from middle childhood into adolescence is that the gap gets wider and wider. So the children with low motor competence don't come back once we hit adolescence. The gap just gets bigger and bigger and bigger as we move through the teenage years. So at the moment, the last lot of literature I saw, we've got data on 14 and 15-year-olds. And clearly, the people with low motor competence are significantly less active than the people with high motor competence. All right, does that make sense? So now we've got what they call a positive spiral of engagement. Once they feel reasonably competent at moving, then moving is more fun, and we make more choices to move, and we make different choices to move, right? So we increase our repertoire of moving. If I like moving and someone says, oh, you want to go try snowboarding this weekend? And I'm like, well, I've never done snowboarding. Yeah, let's go give it a try, right? But if I don't like moving, and I don't think I'm very good at moving, and someone says, why don't you come try snowboarding? I'm going to go, no, I've got homework to do. Right? So once we've got our fundamental motor skills and we're reasonably good at those, then that opens up a bigger repertoire as we get older and the opportunities are afforded us. Right? So we just get better and better and better, and the people who weren't very good get worse and worse and worse. Okay? So we have on the other side of the model a negative spiral of disengagement as we move through middle childhood into adolescence. Right? And once we're at the point where we give them the option to do PE, they choose not to do PE. So the picture, for me, is really interesting because it comes back to how physically active can I get the children on the playground at the CBC, because the more physically active they are, the better their motor competence becomes, right? If I'm running around the playground being a nutcase, I get better at running. if we're whacking baseball bats, whether I'm whacking the cone or I'm whacking the ball, I'm still being physically active, and sooner or later I am going to get better at hitting the ball, right? Because my brain is playing with the weight of the bat. It's judging where I've got to move my arm to swing the bat and deal with that additional weight and lever on the end of my arm. Right? So even when they're hitting the cone, their brain is still learning something about that skill. Okay? So the more active we can get them at the point where perceived competence isn't really an issue, the more competent we're going to get them as they move into kindergarten. When they leave us and they go to kindergarten and then to first grade, their fundamental motor skill foundation is going to be stronger. And then the research says that we're going to see them make better choices about being physically active. And then we impact health. So what Stoughton and Goodway were trying to say is, there's a developmental trend. If we can get them more competent when they're younger, then we don't see such a big divergence between the two groups as they get into adolescence. If you add into this picture girls versus boys, it gets even worse, right? Because we already know girls are less skilled than boys at object control skills. And many of the games and activities that we offer them as teenagers are driven by object control. We don't give them a lot of dance, we don't do as much aerobics or yoga, right? We play baseball, we play basketball, depending on the teacher. So, motor competence then plays a key role. It's a driving force as we look at older children in supporting or not supporting, if they're not motor competent, physical activity behaviors across childhood and adolescence. So what we do with them in early childhood drives what physical activity behaviors we see through the teenage years. The negative spiral of disengagement is representing someone with low motor competence. Over time, what we think is happening is that low motor competence means they choose to be more sedentary, less physically active, and their perceived motor competence goes down, and then their fitness levels go down, and over time their health outcomes go down, right? So the more physically inactive I am, the more chance there's going to be that I'll end up at an unhealthy weight. If we look at the positive spiral of engagement, high motor competence, over time, right, as they leave early childhood, as they leave the CDC and they move into kindergarten and first grade, over time, those fundamental movement skills are going to drive higher levels of physical activity and their enjoyment of movement and their belief that they're good at moving, right? And so then we see higher levels of physical activity, more choices to be physically active. All right? So, on the playground, what we're doing on the playground is highly, highly, highly important. Even if we're not getting the skill that we really wanted, right? If they're goofing around with a station, that doesn't mean their brains aren't learning something. So when Maddox grabs the hockey stick and swings round and round and round like this with the hockey stick, and the early childhood students are going nuts at him and telling him off, and I'm like, He didn't do anything, right? It doesn't matter. Leave him alone. Because his brain is learning about circles, learning about the weight of the hockey stick. Right? As long as he doesn't let go while he's spinning around and the hockey stick flies off and smacks someone in the face, it doesn't make any difference. He's being active. He's learning. His brain is learning a cognitive concept, even if it's not what we had planned. And it might drive him to come back and try hockey the next time we put the hockey sticks out. And then he'd actually maybe learn the skill. Does that make sense? So it's a really cool model. Our book hasn't picked it up, which I was surprised to see because that's a brand new version of that textbook. I did think they would include this in there, but not yet. Probably the next version, I guess. The only book that I know it's in right now is the book that Goodway is a co-author on. So she managed to slip it in the new edition of that textbook. But the article is up for you to read, and this article was in JOPAD, so that's the Journal of PE, Recreation and Dance Practitioner Journal, very easy to read. So it's not too techy to read and understand. If you love it, I've got some more technical ones. They've done a couple of newer ones where they've added some additional data on other age groups. So if you'd like copies of those, let me know, and I can get you copies of those. Okay? Excellent. Skedaddle.
Oh, yes, we can go. Shit. Don't think twice, huh?